Welcome to What Really Matters podcast, Everyday Spirituality with Karen Wyatt. Thanks for joining me here again for another episode of this podcast. I have an announcement. If you're a regular listener, in just a few weeks at the beginning of the new year, I'll be switching the production schedule for this podcast to every other Monday instead of every Monday. And this What Really Matters podcast will be alternating Mondays with my End of Life University podcast. So I'm cutting my workload in half, and I'll do each podcast every other week starting in January of 2026. So if you find a What Really Matters episode missing one Monday, just remember there will be a new episode over on End of Life University, so you can go there if you'd like to listen to that podcast as well. So I'll move on now with my content for today. I recently wrote a Soul Code post talking about immortality projects, and I want to reiterate that a little bit and discuss it with you here. It's a term that was coined by Ernest Becker, who's a social anthropologist who wrote the book The Denial of Death, which is still a really powerful book. Parts of it are somewhat controversial, but it's been a really powerful book for pointing out the fact that human beings live in a constant fear of death. It is innate to us, it is hardwired into us, and it is our egos that fear death, and we're the only living creature to have an ego. And the ego has an awareness of mortality that is terrifying to the ego, and therefore the ego constructs what Becker calls immortality projects, which are structures and conditions the ego creates in order to avoid the reality that it will die one day. So when we talk about the fear of death, we need to really understand it isn't a choice to be fearful of death. It is part of us. It is part of what makes us human. And so it is an element of our ego that needs to be understood and recognized. And if we don't ever help the ego come to an awareness of the reality that we will die one day and it's okay, if we don't help the ego learn how to carry that knowledge with grace instead of running from it and trying to escape from it, then we will live our lives in this state of denial where we deny that death exists, and therefore we limit our capacity to fully experience and enjoy life. And we say that all the time. You read it in memes on the internet or see it on bumper stickers or t-shirts. But the reality is, when the ego has to protect us from awareness of death, then it protects us as well from what life really is, because life is finite, life is limited, life is precious. And it's only when we acknowledge that life will come to an end that we fully appreciate life and we can embrace all the aspects of life and make the most of it. So Ernest Becker's work is really important, and I really like the term immortality projects. And let's think about some of the projects that the ego constructs and clings to. One of those is religious devotion. And I'm not saying this is not the fault of religion, but this is how some people approach the religions that they are part of or believe in, and it's why some people choose to be part of a religion. It comes from the ego's fear of death, and by being attached to a religion that seems to have an answer to death or protection from death, the ego feels safer. So religious devotion can be an immortality project for some people. Also, the whole entire wellness industry and wellness practices, there's nothing wrong with those practices at all, but sometimes the ego clings to them in a false belief that if I do this, I won't die. following this diet, following this exercise plan will prevent me from death. And that's the ego's goal and intention. Wellness and wellness practices become an immortality project. Any type of focus on what we achieve and create and build, and that even can include our legacy projects. We're creating something with the intention that it will outlive us, but the desire is not just that we embrace and accept death and we want to have something that makes the world a better place after we're gone. The desire is to cling to that particular legacy project as a way of imagining that death won't actually happen for us. So I want you to see there's nothing wrong with any of these projects in themselves. Where a problem arises is when the ego clings to or attaches to an immortality project in order to avoid being aware of death. So another area where people can get caught up in an immortality project is with their political identity or identifying with any type of group, the nation that they're from, a team that they love, identifying with it to an almost cult-like status where they surrender everything to that identity and once again feel protected and safe from their own mortality because they become part of something bigger than themselves, but it is something that they're using to escape, they're using to deny death instead of embracing and holding and carrying the reality of our mortality. And so also the anti-aging movement, that in the very name tells us this is a movement that is fearful of getting older because as we get older, we approach death. And the anti-aging movement has a fear within it of death itself and a desire to escape or prevent or run away from the reality of our mortality. And again, there's nothing really wrong with practicing anti-aging practices. It is the intention and the consciousness behind it that makes all the difference. If it's being driven by the ego out of fear of death, then it tends to be counterproductive for us. I'll tell you just a couple of stories of two different patients. I wrote about this in my Soul Code post, but I'll just reiterate them there. The first was a man who was dying of cancer. And we got to know him in the last few weeks of his life, and he was extremely bitter and angry because he had lived his entire adult life as a devotee of a particular religion. And he had really narrowed his life experiences, what he allowed him to do and to partake of. He had really limited pleasurable experiences because he felt that was part of the religious teaching he was living by. But what he revealed to us is that entire time he had believed if he did that, if he lived his life in this extremely limited way, he would be rewarded with good health and long life, and he would not have to face death. He was fooling himself and tricking himself. He had created an immortality project out of religious devotion that his ego allowed him to believe would save him from the death that all the non-religious people would experience. And he was so bitter. He told us, I didn't experience any of the joys or pleasures that my friends did because I thought it would help me avoid this. And now here I am dying of cancer, the thing I feared the most, and it's happening to me, and I am angry. I feel betrayed. I feel abandoned. I feel deceived. And it was a really difficult way for him to go through the end of life experiencing this complete collapse of the belief system that had carried him through his entire adult life. And we spent a lot of our time talking with him about that and trying to help him find peace, which eventually he did right before he died. And another patient, in a very similar way, was a woman who had taken up wellness practices her entire adult life. She didn't believe in God. She wasn't religious. However, she did have a religious-like devotion to wellness. So she had a rigorous exercise routine. She ate a very, very restricted diet of only the foods that she thought would be the best for her health or that she read. She meditated, but on an extreme schedule that was punishing to her, not enjoyable. Everything that she did had a lack of joy and a lack of pleasure for her, but it was the ego's immortality project. Surrendering all of the joys of life felt worth it to her because she believed she would stay healthy forever, that she would not ever get sick or ever die. And she likewise was dying of cancer at a fairly young age. And like my other patient, she was bitter and angry. She felt like she'd been deceived. She'd been cheated of her life. And she had extreme anger. We spent a great deal of time talking with her about it and trying to help her find a way to peace. She felt that she'd been cheated out of life itself, but that she should not be sick with cancer. She should not be dying because she had done everything right. So once again, this is a false belief of the ego that it can protect itself from death somehow by living the right way, following all the rules, doing the right things. And it's a false belief that death is somehow a punishment for living the wrong way, and instead of an acknowledgement that death is part of life and that everyone will one day die. So both of my patients, they suffered a great deal at the very end of their lives in the last few weeks because of the collapse of their false beliefs of their immortality projects that the ego had created in order to escape the fear of death. So as Ernest Becker teaches us, the denial of death costs us our freedom to live fully, to savor the moment and enjoy everything. And it also, here is another trap from being part of an immortality project. It makes us vulnerable to manipulation, to cults and cult-like behavior, and conspiracy theories. And so I wrote a little bit about that in the post, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as well, because that's something we're seeing everywhere around us today. That's happening around us. We see people adhering to groups in a cult-like manner and believing and surrendering to groups and what groups tell them instead of using critical thinking and making their own decisions for their own lives. And all of this behavior comes from the fear of mortality. They're all immortality projects being created by the ego. So belonging to a group in a cult-like manner, and there's nothing wrong with belonging to groups. I'm not putting down groups in general. I'm saying, once again, only if the ego is using the group as an immortality project. So being part of a group gives the ego a place to hide from death. So the ego and the mind can focus totally on the group, what the group teaches, how the group tells them to live, what the group tells them to believe. The critical thinking skills are abandoned because it's dangerous to think for oneself. And following a leader, following a group and their practices and their beliefs is much safer. But there is an immortality project involved in that. If part of the belief is I'm giving up my own thinking and freedom so that I can be safe from death, so that I will be part of the protected group that doesn't have to worry about death, that doesn't have to face mortality. So the leader of the group gives the ego someone outside of them to surrender to, instead of surrendering to one's own higher self. Because surrendering to our higher self, our souls, for the ego requires an awareness of mortality. So that's the catch. We have to be aware of our mortality. We have to help the ego address the truth that we will die one day and find a way to live with that, and then surrender to the higher self, which is our observing and witnessing self that can help the ego and provide guidance and help with critical thinking in order to make the very best decisions for life, for how to enjoy life fully and get the most out of life. But instead of surrendering to the higher self, again, which requires an awareness of immortality, the ego leads us to surrender to some sort of a leader, a cult-like leader of a religious movement, of a wellness movement, of whatever group we happen to belong to. And believing in an ideology which is taught by our group, a particular way of thinking, gives the ego something solid to cling to. The ego can say, I believe this, and read off a list of principles, and they all come externally. They are not principles that the self knows or has learned. They've all come externally from someone else teaching these principles. Critical thinking to someone who's involved in this cult-like behavior because of the ego's immortality project, it feels dangerous, because questioning the immortality project means questioning the thing that protects the ego from death. And so thinking is avoided. It's risky, it's dangerous. And I think we see that all around us. We see so many people following. In a sense, we always use the metaphor like sheep, but sheep are following their herd-like instincts to be part of the group. Sheep don't have an ego, and they're not capable of higher cognition as we are, or critical thinking. But in this metaphor, people behave as if they were sheep without the ability of higher thinking, without the ability of making decisions for themselves. They follow and choose to surrender their own freedom to make decisions for their own life. And again, it's an immortality project because they're doing it, the ego is doing this and creating all of this out of the fear of death. And in our current digital age, we're seeing something else emerge, which is the use of technology as an immortality project. So this is relatively recent for humankind to utilize technology, something that we ourselves created, but to turn it into an immortality project. And some examples of that are, let's say, binge watching a television or streaming content, or even YouTube videos, just binge watching in order to escape the real world and to be part of a fantasy world. Also, video games, playing video games addictively, where there are eternal worlds within the video game in which you never really die. Even when a character dies, there are ways to get more lives and to bounce back and live again. And so immersing oneself in the world of a video game is an immortality project, a place where, oh, sure, you might die temporarily, but you will always come back. And so you can see how that fits really well with the ego's desire to not face mortality. Social media itself is a type of immortality project in that we can curate a false self through social media. We put together pictures and stories that may not be fully true or fully represent who we are, but they are the stories the ego would like to believe. And we post them on social media where this false image of ourselves exists and will always exist. It can always remain on social media. And again, it's another way of escaping the reality of death. We may find virtual companions on the internet that we don't have to face the thought that they may die, through groups that we belong to and join. We may not ever know that those companions we've connected with virtually will also experience death. So we don't necessarily have to cope with mortality when we're part of those groups. And then another example now is AI, and people choosing to form relationships with AI. AI has no ego, no soul, no illness, can never get sick, can never die, although any particular model could be shut down. But when we choose to have an AI companion or soulmate, we're choosing something, in a sense, immortal to cling to that helps us forget that we are mortal and we are going to die. And one thing I write about in my Soul Code posts is how we can use AI differently. We can use AI to help us with our fear of death, to help us understand and remember that we're mortal, and to help us learn skills and tools for living with the fact that we're mortal. So what needs to happen is that we need to recognize the role our ego plays in our attachments, in our view of life, in our fear of death. Once we activate this observing and witnessing part of ourselves, we are able to look at ourselves and for the first time to see our own egos in operation. And it takes some practice to do that. One thing that I say over and over that can really help is journaling, because when you journal, you might write as your ego or from your ego, but you might go back and read what you wrote from your witnessing or observing self that reads those words and says, wait a minute, that's not right. That's not exactly how I feel. There's something more than that. And though you can also write from your higher self and write messages to your frightened ego to reassure and calm the ego, and to write the higher wisdom that you're learning about life that helps you cope with mortality and helps you live with it. So the first thing we need to do is understand ego and recognize each of us has an ego that actually dominates most of our behavior, most of our thinking. And the ego carries our identity and navigates the everyday world for us. The ego is essential. No one can live simply from the higher self. We must have the ego to help us in the real world, to help us carry on relationships, negotiate with other people, and simply live in the day-to-day world, to go do the grocery shopping and the laundry and help us make those decisions, those everyday decisions. The ego, however, desires control, wants to be in charge, wants to make the decisions, because the ego's frightened and fearful. The ego wants to be special. It's always aspiring to be the best and to be better than others. And we have to watch out for that tendency. And the ego can at times hijack our spiritual growth. So this is one caveat. When you begin to become aware of the ego from your higher self, and the ego accepts, oh, wait, there is this other way of seeing the world. The ego sometimes can hijack the entire process and take it over. Oh, so we're working on becoming death aware now. Okay, well, fine. Then I'm going to talk to everyone else about how they're dying, but I'm never going to face the fact that I might die. I'm going to help other people do their advanced care planning and look at their own death, but I am definitely not going to talk about my death or face the fact that I'm mortal. And so this is a tricky point, because we may convince the ego to accept mortality for everyone else in the world while it's still struggling with its own mortality. We have to remember that, and we have to constantly be doing our own work with the ego, our own ego, to make sure, hey, all the practices and things I'm recommending for other people, I need to be doing those too. And I need to be helping my own ego become aware of my mortality. Otherwise, the ego is a highly skilled masquerader, and it can look to you like you have equanimity about death. You don't need to worry. You don't need to think about that. You don't need to read the books. You don't need to to do the conversation games. You don't need to do the work personally for yourself, because obviously you can teach it to anyone else. You have obviously already know all of these things. That's what the ego wants you to believe. But in fact, each of us has to go through our own little dark night of the soul with the ego, where we sit in our pain and our fear and suffering and loss and grief, and recognize this is real and this is going to happen to me. And I am going to learn how to carry my own personal pain even while I'm helping other people carry theirs. And this applies to me sitting here telling you these things. It's equally important for me that I do my own work as well. So we need to become aware of the ego and how it operates. We need to use our higher selves to observe the ego and watch it every day and keep track of what's the ego doing now? What's the ego thinking? Where's the ego leading me? And recognize the triggers and attachments of our own ego. What triggers us to kind of lose our critical thinking ability and go into the ego's fear and get lost there. Also, what wounds is the ego carrying from the past? Because the ego is also the repository of the wounds and hurts of our entire lives, everything that we've experienced. And many times can bury those wounds in order to protect us. But it is the buried wounds and the buried pain that can spring into action from nowhere in the middle of a crisis and cause us to behave in a way that we don't feel good about. So gradually, part of our spiritual work needs to be unearthing all the buried wounds so we can look at them more closely, study them more deeply. And as we bring the light to those wounds, they become much less powerful. We can actually recognize in advance, this is one of those situations where I'm likely to lose it and get upset here. Oh, someone said that same thing to me that always gets me and triggers me. We learn gradually to see things coming, to see the triggers as they're arising, to pause for just a moment and say, wait, but I don't want to act on that today. I don't want to get mad and yell at someone and act out. I want to stop. I just want to be silent for a moment and acknowledge, wow, that hurt. I still feel pain about that. I'm going to keep working on it. And just give love and grace to yourself, to your ego, to your wounds, and allow them to be present, because it is awareness that changes everything. So the ego is our extremely important ally, and we need to learn to observe our ego without judging or rejecting it. And that's every time I talk about the ego, it feels as if there's so much negativity about the ego and how it operates and what it does. But in reality, our ego is a vital companion. We cannot live here on planet Earth without it. And the higher self respects the ego, has compassion for the ego, simply wants to shine light on it. And it's only the ego that actually hates ego. Ego hates its own wounds. Ego hates its own shadow. Ego hates its own behavior. And so every time we feel that for ourselves, we feel anger at ourselves, remember that is also coming from the ego. So the takeaway message from today is to remember that at its heart, the ego is terrified of dying, of no longer existing. And that's a reality that has to be carried. It can't be buried. It can't be escaped. It can't be changed or fixed. It's real. The ego will die one day. And even though, we can enjoy the thought that, there's an afterlife and my soul will go on forever, we still have to cope with the terror of the ego at the thought of dying, or we will not be whole, complete people fully enjoying and living life. So my invitation to everyone is simply to do this ego work. And over the next year, I'm planning to do a lot more episodes talking about how we work with the ego, offering tools that could be helpful, because right now this is the defining moment of humankind. If we don't come to terms with the ego and its immortality projects, we are going to destroy ourselves. And we see us spiraling right now. And fear is behind all of it. Fear is behind the hatred and the negativity and the hurtful behaviors and the polarization. And fear of death is the greatest fear of the ego, even though it may masquerade as other types of fear. So coming to terms with the fear of death and helping the ego learn to carry it and to cope with it and to make the most of life anyway, that's our task for 2026. And I'll be talking about it a lot more in the future. I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast and keep listening in. I'll be offering some downloadable tools from time to time, things you can use to work on your own ego. And I wanted to recommend, if you're a spiritual seeker already and this appeals to you, I have a book called The Tao of Death, which is really, it's a spiritual journey companion of verses. It's adapted from the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. There are 81 verses that have to do with death and coping with death and what death teaches us. And so it's a good contemplation tool. You can read one verse a day, perhaps, and journal about it. So that's something I recommend if you're at a place where you feel ready to do that kind of work. If not, read the book, The Journey from Ego to Soul, because that will give you more information about how the ego operates and help you recognize it within yourself. And there will be links for those in the show notes, at least to my books page where you can find those books. So thanks for joining me here today. I'll be back next week. And until then, remember, we're here for love. That's the most important lesson we can learn. And we have to let go of fear in order to love. And love brings grief as well. So grief is part of this journey. Be sure to face your fear. Be ready for whatever life brings you next, and love each and every moment that you have a chance to be here. Bye-bye.